I did 4 tours. So I was mobilized right after September 11th. Virtually the next weekend was our drill weekend. I was a reservist at the time. And my commanding officer at that time, Colonel Nick Reynolds, said, "Who's ready to go?" And 3 of us put our little paws in the air and said, "Yeah, let's go." I had always kept a sketchbook with me in Sketch Marines, but now I was going to do it for real. So I'd worked on helicopters, been in Desert Storm, Desert Shield, Yugoslavia, Somalia, stuff like that. But this time was going to be for real, like in the goo, I always called it, which meant that I was going to see combat and Marines up close and very personal. So I did 2 tours in Afghanistan, and I also did 2 tours in Iraq. And with each tour, I kept seeing more and more combat, and I kept seeing more and more wounded, and of course, dead. And then when I retired, let me back up. While I was in uniform, after my final tour in uniform, there were a lot of guys coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan with some pretty serious wounds. It had almost exclusively to do with IEDs, or vehicle-borne IEDs. And so I started going up to Walter Reed and Bethesda to sketch the wounded at the various stages. At Walter Reed at that time, which was separate, they were doing their occupational therapy and basically doing their final paperwork for their medical discharges. So those kids were Marines, and it was just Marines I did at the time, were pretty much well on their way. And that artwork went in the Marine Corps collection. And I also went to Bethesda, the Navy hospital, where the shock trauma, so you had the more serious people very fresh off the field or still undergoing multiple surgeries. So that made me very aware of how many Marines and soldiers in particular had been wounded, and it wasn't really showing up in the news. So once I retired, I had started a master's program, and the reason I mentioned the master's program is because that some of the guest instructors for the master's program then became partners in the Joe Bonham project, which we'll talk about. In particular, Victor Uoz, and then he brought in his friend Jeffrey Fisher. And then there were others as well through Victor that I met. So I was contacted. The genesis of the Joe Bonham project was contacted by the curator of the military and diplomatic collection of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. And she was saying, "Hey, do you have any art that we might purchase or that you want to donate?" Now that collection has most of the artwork from World War I. The Army commissioned 8 illustrators from the classic age of illustration and sent them over. The program lasted 2 years, and the artwork, the Army didn't have a collection or a museum or anything, so it ended up with the Smithsonian. And believe me, the Army would love to get it back, but they're not getting it. And so that woman contacted me, and I said, "Well, all my artwork that I've done belongs to the Marine Corps." I said, "But I've been thinking about, there's so many guys in the hospitals right now that are, and the phrase just popped in my head, who are still in the fight. Would you be interested in that?" She said, "Oh, heck yeah," because they also were collecting medical things for their museum. That was part of their. It wasn't so much her department, but looking at the advances in medicine for the National Museum of American History. So she saw, could kill 2 birds with 1 stone, images of the wounded, and also they were collecting the new medical apparatuses, things that they were using. So from that point, it wasn't called the Joe Bonham Project yet, and I said to Victor, I said, and also my friend Richard Johnson, a Canadian, he's a Scotsman who was living in Canada, working for Canada's, sort of like their version of the USA Today, called the National Post. And he was another artist who had gone to war as a civilian, so we had met, a lot of this has to do with the internet. people could sort of Google us. I had a blog. Richard was an illustrator for some major newspapers, and he did a beautiful book, Faces of War, and so that allowed us to, different artists to connect. So I took advantage of that because of the internet, and because I had a blog that got real well known. The Smithsonian, she went on the internet, and I don't know if she Googled war artists or combat artists and found me. So all these little things, because of the internet, started sort of coming together. And one of the things that it resulted in was the Joe Bonham Project. So myself, the first trip was myself, Richard Johnson, and Chris Battles, who at that time had replaced me as the artist for the Marine Corps. Now with this show here, the Joe Bonham Project, there's none of Chris's works because he's still the artist for the Marine Corps. So his artwork goes in the Marine Corps collection. So we had set up, actually, by that time, in 2011, Walter Reed had been shut down and combined with Bethesda. I guess the city of DC wanted their land back. It was that 100-year lease was up. So now you have the Walter Reed National Medical Center at Bethesda. Is combined both. So we had it all set up. I had set it up through public affairs to go there to the new combined facility, and we're almost there. We're on 495, and I got a phone call from the public affairs, and we got canceled. So Richard's come all the way down from, I think, Detroit. He was now working for the Detroit Free Press. And I was like, what the heck? So fortunately, I had another contact, a public affairs officer named Paul Greenberg, and I called Paul up, and he was with the Wounded Warrior Regiment at that time. He was a reservist, but he was the public affairs guy for them. And I said, Paul, help me out here. So he made a few calls and said, hey, if you want to turn around on I-95, go back down to Richmond. They have, in particular, 3 Marines who are there going through neurology, in other words, nervous system repairs. And so we're like, okay. So we turned around, zoomed down I-95, and went to the VA hospital in Richmond, Virginia. And the result of that was I wrote, because I had already wrote a series of articles for the New York Times, illustrated articles. And so I contacted my editor, and I said, hey, Peter Catapano, I said, want me to do, I can do another series of articles about these 3 Marines that we got to know and sketched down in Richmond. He goes, oh, that'd be great. So I did a series of 3 articles called Still in the Fight. And the artwork that's over here is from that. Richard went and did a series of articles as well, I believe, for the Detroit Free Press. Or was it the National Post? But anyway, and they got a lot of attention. So now I've met Victor, and Victor had a son who was a Marine reservist, a staff sergeant, deployed twice, intelligence guy, and Victor's like, hey, I would like to, are you going to be doing any more trips? And he said, and my friend Jeffrey Fisher, unfortunately Jeff passed away, he has a son who was a corpsman with the Marines, and he'd sure like to do it too. And these guys were big figures in the Society Illustrators in New York. I was like, well, okay. And at that point, I said, okay, this is bigger than just kind of us writing these articles. Like, okay, there's interest from national museums. I can also tell you now, because of the internet, I'm getting pinged as a result of the New York Times article. Various organizations want to have it, like, hey, is the art available for exhibit? It's like, oh, okay. How do we handle this? So I came up with the idea of, like, let's do a project. And so I said, how am I going to call this? And right away, being a child of the 60s, having read Dalton Trumbo's Johnny Got His Gun, and being, at the age of 14 or 15, wherever it was, freaked out by the book. And then having seen the movie with Timothy Bottoms and being more freaked out, the name Joe Bonham was in my head. And I said, I'm going to call this the Joe Bonham Project. Now, realizing that, 70 years have passed, so probably Johnny Got His Gun and the Joe Bonham Project may or may not be covered by copyright or whatever. I was able to find contact information for Dalton Trumbo's last living child, Mitzi Trumbo. And I sent her an email about what we were going to do and what we were going to name it. And sure enough, she got back to me. She says, I think my dad would think this was great. You'll have no grief from me. Use the name Joe Bonham. So I was like, okay, we're cleared hot for that. So that's where the term Joe Bonham Project came. And for those that don't know, Joe Bonham is sort of this grain-fed Midwestern, all-American kid. And he gets blown up in the trenches of World War I and loses both arms, both legs, face, hearing, everything. He's essentially been whittled down to the bare essentials of maintaining life inside of a body. And, the doctors are all real proud of themselves. Like, look what we did. We've got this piece of meat that's still alive. And they're sort of patting themselves on the back. And suddenly they realize Joe's still in there. He's not a vegetable. He's still in there. And of course, the book, as I tell people, is existentially more difficult, and the movie, than Kafka's Metamorphosis. Forget about it. Or watching the movie The Fly. The poor character at the end's like, help me, which is, pretty hard to watch as well. But it's like, Trumbo really gets you inside of this kid's head and him just waking up to how little of him is left to wake up. Now, the book does not end well for Joe Bonham. He ends up sort of like at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the Ark of the Covenant's put in a wooden box and put into a giant warehouse and forgotten. And so Joe, of course, wants to be put in a glass case, taken around the world, and show people, like, this is what war does to the psyche and to the body. And essentially, that is not honored. And he ends up going to another hospital. The physicians and nurses are told, he'll be twitching and tapping, and it's nothing. It's, even though he's there desperately, at least saying, please kill me if you're not going to show me. So going into the hospitals, and those that look at the Ark at the Joe Bonham Project, these are some serious traumatic injuries that they've received. Young men who are just torsos, who've lost their genitalia, and young men who were at the prime of their life, athletes, wrestled in high school, whatever, who are now, that's all done. They've been whittled down pretty good. And then there's the whole drama of their families. So the Joe Bonham artwork, as we started going in and sketching, and as the project grew, as more artists were added, artists who had virtually no family members, anybody had ever been in the military, let alone themselves, start coming in, going in, sitting in the hospital rooms, and sketching them with the families are there. And one of the things the viewers should know is that they all volunteered. When you go into hospitals, there's a thing called a HIPAA form, HIPPA. I have no idea what it means, but it's essentially a freedom of information release. You're saying, the sketches, the artwork, this is a form of art called reportage art. So when people see the art, a lot of information is written on the sketches. As you're sitting talking to somebody and they're opening up and they're telling you stuff about their lives. One thing about reportage art, and especially combat, what I call combat art, is you'll start writing stuff right on the sketch, incorporating it in. The narrative gets put right there. So when the viewer looks at the image and they're looking at Sergeant Glenn Silva or Sergeant Jason Ross, and they have questions like, oh, well, there's the information. It doesn't have to be out of a fog of not knowing. It's the artists here are really trying to tell their story for them.
Mike, you chose a very interesting title for the project, the Joe Bonham Project. You mentioned about Joe Bonham being warehoused, but his mind is intact. You also chose another naming convention that's additive to the Joe Bonham Project, which is "We Are Not Our Wounds." How does the Joe Bonham story relate to how we view our current veterans, coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, back to like Joe Bonham. I mean, Joe Bonham still knew he was Joe Bonham. I'm in here. I have all my memories, what I was before, my relationships, everything else. So these, and it was almost exclusively soldiers and Marines that we sketched. They would really open up. And they knew their lives had been utterly transformed, but they were still who they were. And so they know that, people are going to come look at them and just see the wounds and look away. One of the inspirations for this was a World War I artist named Henry Tonks, which is a whole other story we can get into as we record here. And Henry Tonks and the surgeon he worked with, a New Zealander named Gillies, were dealing with facial wounds. And you lose your face, you lose your connection to humanity. Very sad stories about fiancés, breaking off engagements and people looking away, and people looking in the mirror and not recognizing themselves anymore. So, like any project, you want to brand it, and so. One of the consistent messages that all these young men shared with us is that, I'm still here, and I'm not my wounds. I'm not my wounds. I mean, this is my new reality, but I bring to it who I am. My family's involved. A lot of dynamics are still there. In some cases, families get stronger. In other cases, not so much. So, with the Joe Bonham project, when people come in, you want that message, we are not our wounds, sort of resonating in the back of their minds as they're looking at the images.
Mike, over the last month and a half, the visitors that have come to visit the exhibit many of them have been emotionally impacted. Mm-hmm. Because these prints and illustrations are quite graphic, but they also take you to the you can see almost the personalities and the souls of how the artists have depicted these wounded veterans, which is an amazing work that your artists and illustrators have accomplished. But one comment in particular from a visitor said, this is a exhibit that needs to be brought to members of the U.S. Congress, the U.S. President, and other officials. What is the message that you would like to be conveyed about this exhibit and about what it's about to the American people?
Oh gosh. Well, let's say there was a time when war hit closer to home. If you had the Revolutionary War, sons and fathers, they went off, and families were, women and younger sons and had to support the family. So they were very conscious of the reality from day one. And perhaps as word came back that someone had been killed, they knew that was a possibility with their loved one. And also the possibility they'd never know how they died, or where they were buried. So it was very close to the bone. And then you get into the Civil War, which impacted virtually every household. War was still close to home. It was especially with the Civil War. Now you had newspapers could actually have illustrations. You had new printing processes, so that field sketches, let's say by Winslow Homer, could be sent to New York or Washington or wherever the major newspapers were, and be turned into etchings very quickly. They all sort of had a very similar look, because the illustrators that were doing the etchings were trained to kind of just do somewhat stereotypical, but people's appetite for those images was fantastic. There's not an antique store even here in Carlisle you can't go to and find Harper's newspaper or whatever it is with those illustrations. You can still buy them. Their families saved them, and letters were very important. And you even had telegraphs, so sometimes the word would come pretty fast if somebody was wounded or killed. Give you an example. Good old Walt Whitman. He ended up in Washington D.C. As a nurse, because his family in Brooklyn got a message that his brother George, who was apparently the only stable person in the entire Whitman family, had been killed or wounded or something. So they were losing their minds. So Walt, being the most next stable, he goes down to Washington, finds his brother. He was lightly wounded. He wasn't killed. And then Walt Whitman's like seeing all this, carnage and starts being a quote unquote dresser of wounds. So you get into, Spanish-American War and yellow journalism, and the appetite for information is great. And then of course World War I, and World War II, you got that complete saturation. Then something starts to happen, I think, from Korean War into Vietnam and on, where the public is not quite in touch. It's happening to somebody else's kid. It's happening somewhere else. It's that, not my backyard. In my opinion, the whole NIMBY thing starts to kick in. So that now here we are in 2023. The percentage of people in the military is what, 1% or less, and the percentage of people who have served, maybe, from who's left from World War II up to present day, maybe 4 or 5% of the population. So people's interaction with people who have served is, quite minimal. And so, as your foundation knows, that public input to decision making, policy, has just sort of been shuffled off to the side, And so, part of what the Joe Bonham Project would like to do is in a very analog way with artwork, is to get that back in, quite frankly, into people's faces, in a way that is direct, without being morbid, without being morbid, in a way that people don't expect, because they look at the art and go, wow, that's a really beautiful drawing of a pretty, just like people see Henry Tonks's sketches, actually pastels of these British soldiers. It's like horrendous wounds, but then you have these soldiers' beautiful, youthful eyes with a face that's devastated. So, to put the humanity back into, this thing we call war. It's not so much that we're here to protest war. It's just, war is a reality, in my opinion. War is a reality like pain in childbirth and forest fires. It is, but we can certainly do a better job of how we get into it and how we get out of it. And so, and also, I think one of the dynamics when people, like you said, people come and see this art, which is a word I've heard often, we've been reviewed by magazines and television stuff, is the word compelling. So people are sort of like compelled to look at it. It's like, oof. And I think that the artwork, nothing against photography, but I think art, sketches, paintings, have a ability, almost a poetic ability. And I didn't make up this concept. Somebody once said that photography is like prose and artwork is like poetry. They both have a lot in common, but you certainly know the difference between a poem and a good, well-written paragraph. They both have their own energy and their own power. But what I'm leading up to, and I know I'm bouncing around here, is that this type of artwork is called reportage art, or reportage illustration. Now, I never knew that until some professor in England, University of the West of England, created a website called The Reportager. And myself and Richard and a couple other artists, we showed up on this site about reportage art. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then I was invited to teach some classes at some universities. So I said, well, what do I call it? I mean, just like We Are Not Our Wounds, the Joe Bonham Project, artists, you got to sort of brand yourself, come up with something, kind of a hook for people to sink their teeth into. So I said, well, I'll call the course Reportage Art. Now, I always like to find where words come from. The metaphoric content of words is incredible. And a lot of words come from initially kind of visual stuff. Chinese calligraphy is the best example. And so I look up the word report. And it's just, like a lot of words, it comes from Latin. And it's 2 words, re, and portare. And re means back, and portare means carry. So, report, bring back. So that makes perfect sense. Journalist who reports go out, sees the basketball game or the fire down at Joe's, bar and grill or whatever it is, and brings back and writes it and puts it in the newspaper. But here's what I'm getting at. The interesting thing, especially that came out in the Joe Bonham project, is there's another word that's root is exactly reportare. And that is the word rapport, which I find amazing. Because one of the things that happened when we would sketch these people is the rapport that would start happening. Just like the tagline, we are not our wounds. It's something that they communicate with us. And also, they, if you asked them, they would tell you. If you said, you still got your, genitals? Nope, gone. Or do you remember what happened? Oh, yeah. And you'd look around, and a lot of times there's family in the room, and you'd see the mother or the girlfriend or the wife go, what? It's like, oh, yeah, I remember. Remember everything. Why didn't you tell us that? Well, you never asked. And so, a lot of times these guys like, okay, if they don't ask, I'm not going to tell. Whereas we would come in there, especially myself as a combat veteran, you establish that rapport, you start sketching them, and this magic starts to happen. And hopefully that same magic that ends in the word compelling is what happens when people come and they see this body of artwork.
Well, Mike, there's no doubt it's compelling. And in fact, reading some of the artists' narrations that did a lot of the work here, especially Jess Carlilse, how it impacted her.
Yeah.
But if you could give a voice, my last question, if you could give a voice to these collective men who are so severely wounded and were traumatized by combat, and I know they are not their wounds, they are more than that, but what voice would you give them in a collective sense if you wanted to project what they're trying to say as they recover from their wounds, as they now participating as whole members of society in many ways? What would be the message that they would want to convey?
Well, it's just like, as you know, in this show we showed a music video called Still in the Fight, Mike Corrado. And it's that they are still in the fight. And I think I don't think any of them would not say, when you're making these big decisions, we want a place at the table. Because this is where it's going to end up. However you think it's going to start, in glory or vengeance or, whatever you think, power play, whatever you think that and those of us in the military, you always hear like the words like tactics, strategy, doctrine, all these big highfalutin words, but and certainly in the Metro DC area, you have so many consulting firms that are making big bucks, influencing decisions, whether through contracts that the Pentagon sends out, like, hey, crunch all these numbers or, give us some advice. I think these guys would legitimately say, like, hey, and we need a place at the table too, because this is where it's going to go. I don't know where you think it came from, but this is where it's going to go in our culture. This is, maybe our hometowns will know about us, but, we're still here and we should be at the table. And just about every show we've ever had, and it's very apolitical. We have artists here, people like myself who went from being a liberal Unitarian Universalist to a right-wing nutcase, to other artists who have done quite famous illustrations in Rolling Stone, anti-Trump type stuff. And I'm not saying I'm a Trumper, but I think all these images testify to young men saying, we need a place at the table because this is where it's going. And specifically, one of the things that I realized in this show in particular just popped in my head is one of the, I don't know what the term is I'm looking for, one of the inconvenient truths that lie behind a lot of this artwork is rules of engagement. These wounds testify to rules of engagement. They were wounded because we don't fight wars we used to. Because starting especially in World War I, the industrialization of war. So there's these industrial, highly supposedly nuanced political judgments that are made that filter down to the battlefield, to where these young men are left very vulnerable to things the enemy can do that they can't. And so we may come up with these beautiful, highly supposedly sophisticated vehicles, whether it's the up-armored Humvees or MRAPs that are supposed to, take explosions quite well. Well, every one of these guys will tell you they don't take them that good. They don't take them that good. So that's one of the I think the word subtext that's here is, they would want to sit at a table and say, listen, we're here because you guys made decisions on how you were going to fight this war. And you need to think about it, because this is what is going to show up when the supposed dust settles. We're still here. Ricola. God, I hate the new Ricola commercial.
Anytime you're ready.
I'm Scott Buren, co-founder and project coordinator for the J. Sherwood McGinnis Junior War, Peace, and Justice Project. We are really blessed to have the Joe Bonham Project, We Are Not Our Wounds art exhibit with us in Carlisle here at the Cumberland County Historical Society. And I'd just like to commend Mike Fay and all the illustrators and artists that have put together this incredibly compelling and powerful art exhibit of our wounded veterans who tell the story of really the nature and character of war. And I hope that those that came here to visit and tour the exhibit will come away as different people having a different understanding of the wounds of war, and that we should all understand the impact of war on society, especially our veterans and their families. And again, it's a tremendous gift that Mike Fay and his project has brought to Carlisle. It has certainly enhanced the community's understanding of war, peace, and justice, especially war and conflict, and its impact on the human condition. And we just, we wish the best to Mike Fay and the project as it moves forward, because it has to be seen by the American people. They need to understand the impact of war and the consequences of war, because it's their sons and daughters that fight the nation's wars, and they are forever changed. And these men that are depicted here are the physical wounds, but with the physical wounds come the mental and psychological wounds as well, post-traumatic stress and other wounds. And of course, veteran suicide is also an outcome of the impact of war. So again, thank you to Mike Fay and his entire team of illustrators who brought this great gift to the Carlisle community.
And I'm sure the camera guy was like, holy fuck, because he's just tagging along. He's like, what do I do here? It's like, I just got to shoot footage, right? You got the mom, stepmom's freaking out. The father's just like, because when I was 12 years old, I was the sole witness of a boy getting run over. I was a newspaper boy, right? Tea in the road, right? I'm walking this way. Nice, warm.
Oh, we can talk. We're not interrupting, right?
No, you can talk. You're fine. Absolutely.
Fall day. I'm walking with my bag. Tea in the road, and I look. And it's suburb, right? Split level homes. Cars parked on either side. And I knew the family right on the corner of the Venetskis. 4-year-old runs out. And it's cheerleaders in the convertible. And they just dropped off one of the girls. And he was below there was no way they saw him. And they rolled him, and I saw his head get crushed. And a woman across the street was a nurse, came out, threw a sweater over him. The father jumped up. The father was working with him. The father jumps off the roof, running around. I mean, oh my God, I'm going to talk about it. And I got to tell the girls to stop. So do you want me to do like a voiceover, or?
No. Well, I mean, you can.
Well, Michael, my thought is just film, and then we can
I can pick up your voice from that, so if you wanna.
Well, I think what would, so I'm new to this.
Yeah, but if you wanna tell me what I'm shooting, that's fine. But these guys are here to tear down. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah.
Yeah, but we're not.
Also showing, when I made the selection, is the family members and the caregivers. So, you have this, I can't even pronounce his last name, but with his sons. There's a couple pieces when he's with one son by himself, kind of written down in the corner. It just tells you what's going on, who he was with, how he got wounded. Summer camp girls with bows and arrows, typical stuff. And Kyle Carpenter, probably the most profound wounded that we did our work on.
And he's the one that couldn't hear or see, right?
Well, no, that's a fictional character. Pretty much lost everything from the navel down. You got two views of the same guy. Silva, who got really messed up, lost his genitals, and he helps counsel other, veterans who had similar. One here is Zach Stinson, actually lives in Chambersburg. I wasn't able to get a hold of him. And some of the artwork. So he had much more stubs of his legs.
Oh.
A year later, it's whittled down to a lot less, because almost all of them had to deal with issues of infections from the dirt, the dust. He actually visited in a hospital with the Afghani soldiers. A lot of whom there was like no information who they were. Really, guys are pretty messed up. And then he and I didn't include any of mine, but he and I went out to a homeless shelter in Colorado that has a big clientele of veterans.
And her son has.
So you can see these are the sketches that Richard did of Kyle Carpenter.
She thought it was awesome. So we got the one lead in Chester County that Mike's going to follow up on to have this exhibit go there. I'm thinking, World War I National Military Museum, World War I. Have you ever been there? Kansas City? How awesome is it?
I haven't been to New Orleans yet, to World War II.
I did that, yeah. That was when they were first opening, and some of the exhibits weren't fully fleshed out, but now, man. The Kansas City is amazing. You walk in, and there's this bridge, and the entire floor below is glass. And you're looking like you're walking through the Flanders field.
Have you done Churchill's?
Yeah,
bunker and all that?
I've been there twice, but I love it.
Yeah,
Every time I go there.
that's fun. Yeah, really interesting.
You should. That's like one of the top tourists in
Yeah.
for good reason. You got the Missouri, I think. There's a Churchill Museum there in Missouri.
Really?
That's where it all started.
Yeah.
So they actually have a church.
His own personal vehicle,
Oh, I
one
still
of
own
them
it.
demo chair on top and
Yes,
brought it
the
to the
hot
battlefield.
box.
I mean, some crazy stuff they did, but it's the how they wanted to show these people who were coming back with these incredible facial injuries. Churchill, because he wasn't doing any PR stuff. They, come to there to do a speech. And they said, oh, that would be great. Well, on the note, the president says, hey, if you go. My
Yeah, I didn't mean to tie you up. There's Scott. I'm sorry about that.
Their symbol was the arrow with the sword.
Oh, yeah.
Red.
The SF patch.
Right.
Scott?
They were.
Scott,
They
do
were.
you want us to move the chairs and the coat? Are you getting that? Or?
No, I'm not getting that. So
So he passed away. So his wife Janet, who was so Janet, she's getting old. She usually. So I had a friend of mine who was did the Marine Corps, who's now with Army History. She says, I got a bunch of stuff that's not right in the book. I'm like, office, I think it says like office of the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And I'm like, holy shit. Bob had an original top secret set. It's like, it had a different name, but it's like, holy crap. So Dieter come down, and she had all this stuff, and he was playing. So, when Bob first had passed away, because this was my landlord, and I lived in a little house adjacent to the main house, what they call the penthouse. I lived in the slave quarter in Fredericksburg, Virginia. So the rent was next to nothing, and my job was to carry it during the whole war. I'm like, holy shit. So I'm thinking it's going to be
A 45?
a 45.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. It was better. 1,000 of them, because it wasn't marked U.S. government. But I went on the Colt website, and sure enough, the serial number was one of the 1,000 that they gave. What? It's a Fairburn, what do they call it? Sykes. Fairburn, I have one. He said, and that happens to be, with the provenance and its condition, the most perfect one on the planet. Like, I don't even think he was ever a captain.
Oh, we can't,
And he finished up his
can't
career
forget
as the
Pat
military
Marsh.
attaché
I got
on
it,
French
I got it.
Indochina. Like, Janet wrote a book about it. She said, we used to go to opium and champagne parties at Angkor Wat. And she was good friends on, and was one of Woodrow Wilson's representatives to the League of Nations, pushing it, old school Democrat. But the family name, the big family name, was Montagues. And,
walk through. Hey, how you doing?